There is a kind of power that doesn't arrive with a crown or a command. It arrives through absence, through weakness, through the silence left behind by collapsing certainty. Russia, in the early 20th century, was a land stricken with chaos. Still, the empire wore its regal mask, but behind it, something had already begun to rot. Nicholas II, the then Tsar, was struggling to hold a nation he didn't understand. Alexandra, his wife, desperate to protect her son, drifted from orthodoxy into mysticism. And from that need, a door opened. Enter Grigori Rasputin. Born a peasant in the small village of Pokrovskoye, he was a man who said very little, who rarely raised his voice, and yet bent an empire to his will. He didn't manipulate like a villain in a fable. He didn't plot in shadows or whisper in chambers. What he did was subtler, more ancient. He made others believe in him. At that time, institutions were failing. People weren't seeking reason. They were seeking certainty. Rasputin offered neither facts nor policies. He offered something deeper, a feeling that someone knew what to do. And when a manipulator understands the needs of those in power better than they do, control doesn't have to be taken. It is given. This was where his silent power of manipulation began, not in what was done, but in what was allowed, what was welcomed, what filled the silence. Not every empire is toppled by revolution. Some are surrendered from within. Every culture has blind spots, places where reason no longer functions, where tradition stumbles and fear takes root. In Imperial Russia, one of those places was the body of a sick child. Alexei Romanov, heir to the throne, bled from the inside, hemophilia, no cure, no peace. The Tsarina watched her son slip into agony, powerless. Then Rasputin laid his hand on the boy, and the bleeding stopped. There is debate about what actually happened. Was it hypnosis? The placebo effect? A coincidence? But none of that mattered. In Alexandra's eyes, this man had reached into death's shadow and pulled her son back. Power shifted, not through logic, but through gratitude, through awe. When belief becomes necessity, doubt becomes betrayal. Foucault argued that power isn't merely held, it's performed. It relies on repetition, ritual, and the visible enactment of control. But Rasputin bypassed all that. He didn't perform power. He occupied the space that fear left behind. And in doing so, he rewrote the court's logic. Doctors became threats. Ministers became enemies. Anyone who questioned Rasputin wasn't questioning a man. They were questioning the salvation of the royal bloodline. This is the second phase of manipulation, not just being accepted, but becoming irreplaceable. What makes manipulation so hard to detect is that it doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it's born from need. It feels like survival. And so the lie becomes untouchable, not because it hides, but because no one wants to see it. By now, Rasputin had become a symbol, though of what, no one could quite agree. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a parasite. But to the royal family, he was something more intimate, an anchor. This is where manipulation stops being political and becomes psychological. Carl Jung once wrote about the shadow, the disowned self, the part of the psyche that houses what society rejects. In many ways, Rasputin became that shadow for the Romanovs. He embodied what they could not admit, their fear, their weakness, their desperate need to believe in something beyond themselves. But shadows don't stay quiet forever. Eventually, they surface. And when they do, they distort everything. The court began to whisper. Nobles turned cold. Letters disappeared. Reports were forged. Rasputin's name, once sacred, became volatile, dangerous. However, he didn't retreat. He leaned in. He drank more, visited brothels, cursed in public, and still he was protected. Because by now, his presence wasn't about wisdom or mysticism. It was about dependence. This is the darkest stage of manipulation, when the manipulator no longer hides, because exposure itself becomes the proof of power. It's not deception. It's domination through contradiction. He's vile, yet untouchable, profane, yet defended. The lines blur until those being manipulated start to defend the manipulator against themselves. At that point, truth is no longer a question, it's a casualty. Control is a strange thing. The more it's grasped, the more it slips, especially when power isn't enforced but entrusted. Rasputin never took the throne, but by the winter of 1916, he haunted it. He was the whisper behind royal decrees, the unseen influence in court appointments. He had no official role, yet his words swayed ministers and terrified generals. A mystic peasant steering the empire's wheel, while those in charge looked the other way. But here's the paradox of manipulation. The more invisible the influence, the more visible the backlash when things go wrong. Famine, war, and riots had broken out in the streets. Rasputin no longer looked like a stabilizing force. He became a phantom, corrupting the monarchy from within. Alexandra clung to him. Nicholas retreated, and the empire turned to rage. Rasputin didn't fall because his power ended. He fell because he was exposed. Manipulators thrive in silence, but silence, when broken, becomes accusation. Pamphlets were spread. Cartoons ridiculed him. Rumors were twisted into weapons. He seduced the queen. He bathed in blood. He cursed the Tsar. Truth didn't matter. The narrative had turned, and belief, once tethered to faith, recoiled in disgust. There was no defense, no correction, only reversal. The mythos that once shielded Rasputin now painted him as poison. His presence, once divine, became profane. The same aura that gave him influence demanded his erasure. A group of aristocrats plotted his death, not just for politics, but to restore a moral order. Killing him was meant to purify the throne, remove the infection, save the soul of Russia. But even in death, Rasputin defied simplicity. When he was poisoned, he laughed. When he was shot, he stood, shot again, he crawled, and eventually drowned. And only then did the body still. What's more terrifying than a manipulator who dies hard? A myth that won't. Killing Rasputin sealed his legend. It gave his manipulation an afterlife, because martyrdom is the final manipulation, one the dead don't even have to craft. The Tsarina wept. The people whispered. The monarchy unraveled. The man was gone. But what he represented remained. And that's the tragic brilliance of subtle power. It doesn't end cleanly. Rasputin manipulated without plan and influenced without doctrine. He became power by reflecting it. And in time, that reflection grew too distorted, too potent to be allowed. But his death didn't break the spell. It shattered the world that let him in. Because when control is built on belief, its collapse is revelation. The monarchy had already died. Rasputin just made it visible. Manipulation isn't an act, it's a condition. It doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself. It waits in silence and operates through belief. By the time it's recognized, it's already done. Rasputin didn't rise through politics or strategy. He emerged from a fracture, a hunger. Nicholas was weak. Alexandra was desperate. The empire was staggering forward on rotted legs. And into that void stepped something undefined. Not a man, a question. He didn't control the monarchy. He revealed what was already broken inside it. And that is the quiet terror behind true manipulation. It doesn't overpower. It reveals what's already vulnerable. Where there is no will to truth, the lie gains freedom. Foucault spoke of systems, of the body politic, of how truth is shaped by power, but he also warned indirectly of something more disturbing, that the things most taken for granted are the things most easily hijacked: belief, trust, silence. Rasputin didn't survive by being strong. He survived by being needed. He didn't argue his way into power. He waited for others to hand it over. And when they did, he changed nothing directly. He became a mirror. That is the silent power of manipulation. It doesn't act upon the world. It enters the space between perception and action. It shapes not behavior, but belief. And when belief shifts, everything else follows. Most manipulation isn't theatrical. It's not Rasputin waving his fingers or a hypnotist's pendulum swinging back and forth. It's more mundane. A look held too long, a word withheld at just the right moment, an agreement made out of fear, not conviction. It is not an event, it is a climate. And once that climate settles, most don't even notice they've adjusted to it. They think the air has always felt this way. This is how empires rot, how institutions collapse, not in explosions, but in altered atmospheres. What looks like control is often surrender. And that's the final paradox. The manipulator appears powerful, but only because those around them were already afraid to think, to speak, to act without permission. Rasputin didn't end an empire. The empire ended itself. He just filled the silence. Now the question lingers. What silent forces are tolerated today? What myths are being nourished by fear and fatigue? Not all manipulators have beards and stare from faded portraits. Some are in algorithms. Some are in boardrooms. Some sit inside the skull whispering, "Stay quiet, blend in, don't ask." Rasputin is gone, but the pattern remains.